This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Maya Doig-Acuña, doctoral candidate in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. Her work is invested in history and memory studies with a particular focus on Afro-Latinx culture and identity that emphasizes diasporic movement and structures of kinship. To that end, she is completing her doctoral dissertation under the title, We Are Her Beloved Descendants, Alternative Archives of Afro-Panamanian Memory, Diaspora, and Kinship. In this conversation, we discuss the expansive reach of Black studies, how Black study informs multidisciplinary approaches to the past, and how Black study sensibilities shape critical discourse around memory studies and historical research. Maya, good morning. How are you today?
Hi, good morning. I'm doing well. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. We're recording this on a Friday. I was, I'm never too old to be excited about the end of the week. It was a busy work week. And I've been really looking forward to this conversation. And I always feel like intro podcast shout outs are good. We were put in contact by our mutual friend, Huey Hewitt, who was one of the first 5 podcasts in this series. So everybody should go back and listen to that one.
100% agree.
I'm really happy Huey put us in touch. I'm really excited to hear about your research, hear about how you think about the field of Black studies for a number of reasons. I just think the kind of work you're doing is extremely important for the field, but also because you're finishing your PhD in Black studies. And my co-founder, co-host, colleague Ashley Newby and I have from the beginning really wanted to emphasize people with PhDs in the field, and whether that's people at any stage of career. And I think especially in this moment of precarity for all kinds of studies around ethnicity, sexuality, race, gender, hearing voices and thinking about perspectives from the finishing in the field of Black studies is just so important. And so that's a long way of saying, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really happy you made the time and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited about this project and about how attentive you all are to really thinking through the field in a historical way and intergenerational way. So I'm happy to be here.
Well, you're an important generation, so part of a very important generation emerging at this moment. So, and I want to hear about your portrait of Black studies, how you imagine the field and how you think about your work in relation to it. But I wanted to start really with a more personal question and ask you, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What is it that drew you to the study of Black life? And for me, always that really important companion question, what is it that sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a few things, certainly Black literature was a huge part of it. I think growing up, I had this period in middle school where I was, I think, probably just very socially unhappy and a bit isolated. And I'm sure a lot of PhDs have these similar periods when they're just like, what, books are my friends. And so I remember I started reading, I read Black Boy by Richard Wright and read The Bluest Eye. And I was like too young to actually totally make sense of these works in a really meaningful way. But I think what started to come up for me was the just like enormous range of what Black life could look like, how gender shaped it, how geography shaped it. It was like the kind of intimacy of conversation that it felt like to be in these characters' inner worlds. I think in those examples, we're also talking about authors who wrote about young people with like tremendous care and young Black people with tremendous care. And so I think I just started to feel like there was a really exciting space to be explored in the study of Black life. And I guess certainly at that point, I didn't view that in academic terms necessarily, but it was like,
Sure.
this is a world that I want to spend time in. And I think that continued to grow throughout my study. And then the other kind of more foundational aspect was just the family and community I grew up in, which is, I'm Panamanian on my father's side, and my mother's from Chile. But they were also part of this broader community of mostly Caribbean and Latin American leftists. And, me and my brother used to have this joke that family birthday parties and celebrations, somehow, even if it was like somebody's 10th birthday, the birthday speeches would always draw back to these values of like community and like the movement. They'd be like, "Oh, we're so proud of you for turning 16. It's such a huge milestone." And what it really reminds us of is the importance of community and, the possibilities of the movement and everything that we worked for. And we would just laugh at that because we're like,
I
girl,
love that. As a parent,
like,
I
I'm
love
just turning 15. Like, I don't, what does this have to do with the movement? But I think those things together kind of shaped a particular sensibility around intellectual life, Black life, around just like sitting deeply with the past, and also feeling really committed to what it can actualize for the future. And I think that's kind of at the core of Black studies as a field and as a tradition. And so by the time I kind of learned a little bit more in college, my liberal arts school, I did this program called Posse, which is like a scholarship kind of cohort-based program that allowed me to go to this very, very white liberal arts school in Vermont. And oddly enough, I think there is when I also started to just get introduced to the idea of, continuing in the university. And yeah, so I think that those were my streams of arrival, I would say, at the field, at least going back early. Before then, by the time I graduated, I knew I wanted to be a professor. I knew I wanted to, pursue a PhD.
So I'm also interested. Of course, as a books person, as we all are at some level. I really love that books were so much of that transformative. Also, the birthday speech about the movement. Like, I know you just turned 15, but you know what else turned 15?
Yes.
The memory of Che Guevara's. What?
Exactly. Yes.
I'm all for changing children's birthdays for political reasons. But that books factored into that. And were those books at home or libraries, or did you have teachers sort of introducing you to this because you said middle school, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was both. I had this teacher who, in retrospect, I'm really surprised had all these books in her classroom because I don't remember her being particularly politically minded. She was white. But maybe she was young and kind of new to the profession, and maybe that also made her a little bit more attentive to kind of the range of what we could be reading. And so she had this basket in the classroom, and I just remember the 6th grade classroom, and we had like reading time every day, and I would just go to that one basket, and that's where The Bluest Eye was. That's where Black Boy was. That's where The Color Purple was. And so I remember those being really formative for me. And then at home, we also had a lot of books. As I mentioned, my parents' own kind of political history. Although that didn't necessarily always look like novels as much as we had a lot of historical nonfiction. We had, I remember we had one of Mumia Abu-Jamal's books, and I remember also writing a report on that for school in my...
Love that.
Yeah, just... so those were, I think, that kind of early education, and I think just taking that for granted, to be honest, just feeling oh yeah, this is just what's around. This is what everybody cares about, actually.
Yeah.
Which turns out not to be true, but I think it's useful when you're young to feel that.
And I mean that's what's around is such an interesting thing for me. You know, when you talk about even just the spatiality of that, like there's a basket of books in the classroom, and you know that's where I gravitated. You know, it's just about movement in space, that everything is right at hand and familiar, and you know, as fun and funny as the sort of birthday speech anecdote is. I mean, I really love that. That's why I keep bringing it up. But you know, that sense of Black life and its documentation and its articulation and its varieties being in, you know, at hand everywhere. You know, that as a theme across so many of these narratives in our podcast conversations is really interesting to me, like where Black life both is available and not available, and where does formal education, college and graduate school, connect to that? You know, is it bridging a gap where it's not available, but there's a kind of longing for it, or it's everywhere, and then you're like, oh, but it's also this academic study, or as you said, it just seemed like kind of continuous, just in a shifting mode. And you know, you say there, you said there, you know, obviously give those literary examples of Black Boy, Bluest Eye, and Color Purple, but also these history books, and nonfiction pieces. You know, what was it then that, you know, at the end of your time in college that made you say, you know, I don't want to do a history PhD, I don't want to do an English PhD, but I want to do a Black Studies PhD? You know, that's an interesting part of this for me, because you know, I loved reading, I loved literature, and it's also part then of your college, but then it's Black Studies is the place you wanted to go.
I think that that's where we get to the longing that you brought up. You know, I went to school that was 3% Black, and I was
3%.
Yeah.
I gotta do better than that. Sorry.
Yeah.
Wild.
Yeah, I mean, I it might be 4 now, I'm not sure, but when I went, it was 3%, and it's a small school, and so when you do the math, it ends up being, I don't know, it was something crazy, like, there's, like, 80 Black people at the school, and you know everybody, you know? Like, it's, um and I think there's this dual experience there of, um it just felt so different from the world I had grown up in, and also because of that level of just disparity and who's there. There's also this, like, closeness that emerges, right, around you, like, you know, those 80 folks become kind of your whole social world or a big part of it. Um But I also just felt like I wanted to return, I think was part of it. Like, I'm like, "Ah, I grew up in New York, I grew up in Brooklyn." Um, I grew up in um, a really expansively Black space. You know, you were talking about spatiality before, and I think that that's just sort of the reality of New York, of a lot of, I think, the East Coast in general, and the Northeast in terms of what Blackness, what constitutes Blackness, what it looks like. You know, I grew up in my father's side is, they're Panamanian of Caribbean descent, and so Spanish speaking, but also English speaking, French speaking, and I think I just needed to be somewhere where there were, like, people were interested in the texture of those kinds of communities, and I think history and English, it felt like those were options, like those were, um, possibilities of study, but they weren't kind of the main project, and, I was an American Studies major in undergrad, which I loved, but I think the corners even of American Studies that I was most invested in were also where I was introduced to Black studies, you know, like where,
Yeah.
the extent to which it brought me closer to that, and so I think as I left undergrad, I knew that that's where I wanted to be, that I really wanted to be trained in that space, and I wanted to be in an intellectual, home where that kind of granular consideration, of Black community history, of Black geographies, um, of Black storytelling, where that was sort of a given, right,
Yeah.
to the project.
I love that. Thank you. I'm so glad I asked that follow up, because I mean, it gets really to the heart of of the pull, I think, of Black studies for so many people who have, when they have disciplinary training, it's like, where's the uncontested place to study Blackness, where I'm arguing for the legitimacy of, philosophy rather than the legitimacy of Black lives. It's like, that's no small exhale,
Yeah,
to put it lightly. Yeah.
that's a really beautiful way to say it. Yes. Small exhale.
So I want to ask you then about your understanding of the field of Black studies. What's that portrait that you work with? What's the sort of idea of it that guides you? And I always like to ask this in the context of its origins, which was, I had a tension built into it. There was the attentiveness to intellectual life, students demanding that there be a place for the study of Black life, Black history, Black literature, Black art. Disciplines had failed to do that. Black studies, in its first demand, it was going to be that place where you could study the intellectual tradition. And I think that that's still with us today, that the idea of a Black studies department is committed to an intellectual tradition, expansive over the years and so forth. But that commitment is part of the field and part of, I think, the vision of the field. But also at its origin was that moment where Black liberation struggle in its radicalization had really contested those boundaries between study and activism, between books and prescriptive action, between campuses, classrooms, and communities and political spaces. And I think we've inherited that moment of the origins of Black studies in the political imperatives of the field, that is a commitment to a certain kind of liberation vision, certain kind of politics and political sensibility. And those can be at tension, in terms of thinking about like what fundamentally guides our vision and conception of the field, sort of in that context, but also taken obviously in the direction you want. I'm interested to hear what you think, how you imagine the field of Black studies. What's that portrait that helps you think in a sort of Black studies way?
Wow. I again really moved by like the phrasing of that question. I was thinking recently. I'm writing or finishing a chapter right now about.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I always tell my graduates, since you're always finishing a chapter, you're not writing it. It's
Yeah.
like a
Yes.
self-esteem
Yes.
thing. I'm so happy to hear you correct your life.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
You are completing.
Yes, I am completing a chapter, indeed, and I really am. So I'm like, I'm not really still writing that, but um, it's about Black Brooklyn, and about Panamanians in Brooklyn and Panamanian women thinking and remembering Brooklyn. But part of the context there, that I'm considering is also. For instance, the student movement at Brooklyn College in the late 1960s, early 70s, which is at the same time, right, that there are all these fights for Black studies across universities nationally. And then also, the more, I think, within New York City history, recognizable student mobilization at Columbia, right, where there's like this occupation of the campus. There's, coalition building with folks in Harlem. But I learned less in formal settings about what's going on at Brooklyn College, and it's really similar. But what these students are articulating, and I was reading this chapter by Martha Biondi about this, was for a bridge between Black students and Black communities, right? And they are arguing in many ways against this kind of false idea of a meritocracy, right? They're like demanding that the college sort of yank open admissions in certain ways, right? Or completely shift it, create these quotas to make sure that there are people who are part of the local communities who are able to access the university, who are able to enroll, and who are also able in turn to reshape the college. So this is in the wake of these new affirmative action programs in New York State that are like the Equal Opportunity Access Program, like different projects like that. And so they really do transform the demographics of colleges across the state. But they're also, what's built into them, into their design, is this kind of like mandate of gratitude, right? And of like, okay, you're here and you're allowed to be here, but you're sort of allowed just to kind of be in a passenger seat and experience, right, the education that we're giving you, but you're not allowed to change us. And so a lot of the demands are about, no, 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 we are actually going to set the terms of what constitutes learning, what constitutes sufficient education, not just for us, but for the university as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about an intellectual tradition, but it's also about shifting the material conditions of the communities who are surrounding these colleges. And I guess that part is at the core of how I understand Black studies and what I think of as a practice of Black studies that continuously should ask us to return to it, of how is our intellectual work also interacting with the material conditions under which we live?
Mm-hmm.
What is the relationship between the intellectual work that we do and Black communities who are inside and outside of the university? There should be a relationship there.
Mm-hmm.
Who are we accountable to? And yeah, so I guess what the portrait of Black studies that I imagine is, and that I look to, is this moment of insurgent recreation and reuse of the institution. So they're not also foregoing the institution entirely or saying what we do can just exist outside of here. They're saying, no, there are clearly resources here. There's clearly a space. Let us repurpose that space and let us redefine what it means to be well educated for everybody who goes there. And so that's, I think, what I want to see more of, and I think part of what I see as our inheritance as Black studies scholars, if that makes sense.
That was really well narrated and put. I think that every podcast has multiple points, but usually a kind of signature point where I'm like, this is something that every listener will take away for something to really think hard about. And the way you articulated that, I think is it was really well put, but it also places some real challenges to everyone listening, who cares about the field of Black studies and wants to think really hard, not only about the idea of Black studies, but how to practice it. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that response. And you mentioned your research, so I want to draw your research in a little bit here and ask you, how you think it fits into the history of the field of Black studies, but also new horizons it pushes. I know you're interested in sort of Black geographies, memory studies, questions of gender, questions of nation. And so I'm interested in how that collection of critical frames and interests, again, how you think about it in relation to the history of the field, but also how you think about it opening up new possibilities for the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I study Afro-Caribbean diaspora formation in Panama alongside U.S. imperialism in Panama, beginning at the turn of the 20th century. So, as Panama Canal construction begins. And there are earlier lineages there for somebody to study the exact same things, but that's generally where I start. And that project is still animated by this central question, which is actually about kinship. What forms of kinship emerge when national belonging is tenuous or withheld? Because these are the conditions in which Afro-Caribbeans in Panama were living in through much of the 20th century. And I would say, and I think a lot of Black studies scholars would say, those are just that's the water that Black folks are swimming in, broadly, globally, certainly in the Americas. And I take an approach, though, that really prioritizes, as you said, memory, family history, affect, how Afro-Caribbean Panamanian women in particular wield memory in the service of creating kind of new geographies of belonging between Panama and New York. And I guess in a broader Black studies project, that question of kinship is so central, especially if you're studying Black diaspora. Can Butler's really important essay. Was that from 2003? Um, she talks about these features of diaspora studies, and interestingly enough, diaspora studies as its own kind of pocket really emerges
Hmm.
actually from Jewish studies, right, and from uh, intellectual work that emerges after the Jewish Holocaust. But this idea of scattering, right, of kind of like of a people that have a sense of collective identity, but it is dispersed across geographies. It's not tied up in the nation state in the same way. Um, then kinship is really important, right? Like how do a people imagine themselves as belonging to one another? Where uh, to whom and to what do they feel political loyalty and ethical loyalty? It raises questions about solidarity. And I think in those ways, family history becomes really interesting because it sort of coheres around perhaps individual family units. But I think when we're looking at in this broader framework of diasporic kinship, it also opens up methodologically what we might consider materials or for instance, archives, in family history. Um, we might look at how a community narrates the neighborhood that they're from,
Hmm.
how somebody who is interested in protecting their community from displacement, what kind of trails they leave behind, and we might consider whether or not that also constitutes family history, how people sort of like use and um, politicize descendant identity broadly as an example of that. And so I guess those are the areas that, on one hand, to me, seem like they have really clear roots in Black studies, um, which I think has long been invested in a sense of who we are as a people,
Hmm.
right, and thinking expansively in those terms. I think W.E. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk also draws precisely on that kind of
Yeah.
articulation. So on one hand, I'm like, this has long roots in Black studies. I don't necessarily see it as like pushing something new as much as I see it as like a return. Um, and so like its new horizons are really, I think, about communing with maybe parts of that tradition that haven't been as deeply engaged in recent years.
I know that there's been some work recently, meaning it's so funny what recently has come to mean at my age, but in that, over the last 10 years or so, there has been work, but I do think talking about Central America generally and talking about Panama in particular is a new and really necessary boundary for Black studies, like thinking about these different spaces. And so, but just to sort of follow up on that and ask a little bit more about the sort of Black studies character of this research, it is interesting to me that even your own narration of your interest in Black life, right, was literature, but also these sort of political and history books in your home and school, American Studies major, African American Studies PhD. You've never passed through a discipline, right, as a sensibility. And how do you think that sort of commitment to non-disciplinary education or consistent non-disciplinary education has shaped how you understand a research project? And even if you have thoughts on it, how you think about a classroom?
Mm, I love that second part of the question. I mean, it's interesting. um, I am in an African American Studies department. At Harvard, they do actually require us to have a disciplinary affiliation.
Hmm.
So we have to select a primary field, and mine is history. Um, but I think I take that very softly, um, and I think the general non-disciplinary commitments of Black studies and of my education so far have really encouraged me to just think about what is useful and to read very broadly. And you mentioned my focus in Central America and Panama, and I think that there's like another side of that too, which is when we're talking about geographies that have been less engaged in the field, then we also do have to read really widely as far as
Mhm.
discipline goes, And just to be clear, there are folks writing on Panama, on Central America, and I think that's actually a really growing space and a thriving one in Black studies. Some really exciting books like Keisha Cornaldi's Panama in Black, Joanne Flores Villalobos' Silver Women, um, Paul Joseph Lopez Oro has just really exciting work on Garifuna communities across Central America and New York. So there's a space there. But I guess my point is, even when I'm talking about these folks, there's historical methods, there's a reliance on, ethnographic work. You just have to be able to talk to each other across discipline in
Mhm.
order to deeply understand what it is that you're studying.
Mhm.
And so I think that that's generally how I move as a scholar is, okay, well, if we care about this and we share some central questions, even if we're pursuing them according to different methodologies, right? We should be talking to each other. And so I think that that's really the main thing is like, who do we talk to?
Mhm.
Who do we read? Let's do that really widely. Um, and and carefully, like I think we should still be intentional about discipline to the extent that it is useful to us,
Yeah.
right? And to making more precise what we ask, to refining the how of of answering. Um, but as a teacher, for instance, like when I'm building my syllabi, I am really thinking broadly about what I want my students to learn. And I think I often, especially if we're talking about undergrad, I feel less committed to a disciplinary education. I think I want them to come away. What's more important to me is like, do they conceptually understand this topic? Are they able to um, extend beyond the timeline of this classroom they're learning? Like, what are the openings for them to get interested in this and to feel invested in continuing education? And I think that those should and usually are quite interdisciplinary, and not just like sometimes they're also not. Strictly scholarship either, right? Like I also want them to some of the material that they've been most excited about my students has also been poetry,
Yeah.
and sometimes that or visual art. Like we always include a trip to a museum, and I think actually that does a lot of the heavy lifting of conceptual work, and I also think that that's partly what I have learned in as a Black studies
Mhm.
scholar,
Mhm.
is that like, oh, I'm a historian. Does that mean that I shouldn't also be paying attention to contemporary Black art? Why wouldn't I be?
Yeah.
And I guess I bring that same ethic to the classroom.
Just an intro podcast comment. Pablo has been a guest on the podcast, so anyone interested in these kinds of issues and just in Black studies generally, it's a fantastic conversation. And Joan, check your inbox. I emailed her. Joan was an undergrad Black studies major actually in my department at Amherst College. So
Yes.
I was you mentioned Joan. I was like, yes, Joan. Hopefully, by the time this is recorded, hopefully, or by the time this appears, hopefully it will have been recorded. But also, I think her book is really one of those, as you were talking about, sort of exemplary Black studies doing history books, right? It has a
Yes.
broader sensibility. Yeah.
Exactly, right? Like there's the method and then there's the what's the broader project here? And I mean, all of the work is amazing. And I actually do know that Joanne was at Amherst because when I started grad school and actually neither Keisha nor her book had come out yet, I was like, I need work on Panama. And there's an earlier generation of scholars doing that, but I was like, oh, there's a gap, you know? And so I read her senior thesis actually.
I was going to say, if it was a senior
Yep.
thesis, I don't know if you consulted that. I mean, I
Yes.
think everybody's nightmare that the senior thesis
I
would be
know.
read, but it was a good senior
But
thesis.
hers is really good, you
Yeah,
know?
no, I
So
read it.
I did read it a long time ago.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
So I have two more questions for you, sort of big picture questions. The first one, thinking about the history of the field of Black Studies, what do you think that the field has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Wow, that feels tricky.
People always feel like the "what is it not done well" thing is tricky. I always think like, I thought this would be the fun part. Everybody's like, that's kind of a fucked up question to ask.
No, it's like an important question to ask. You know,
I
again,
think so.
thinking about our friend Huey and what he's taught me also about the like love of critique, like as in like the love inherent in critique. Actually,
Yeah.
I think it's an important question.
As someone who's been critiqued by Huey as Huey's teacher, I totally agree. It felt like affection.
Exactly. It's like, this is how actually we show investment. I think part of it is about U.S. centrism. I don't think that there's an across the board kind of critique of Black studies, thinking transnationally or diasporically. I think we have incredible, beautiful examples of that. But I guess I'm answering the question in reverse. Second part first, but I would like to see more of that, and I think in some ways I have wanted more of that from my training too. Is to really, and I don't mean to stretch necessarily or to ignore the centrality of a Black studies tradition as formed within the United States and as formed by African American communities, because I think that's foundational. But to also understand that within a broader context in which we see that Black histories have always, right, been formed by transnational exchange and by really porous borders,
Yeah, nicely put.
I'm also a scholar of migration, and so I know that much of what we take for granted today as far as how intensely policed national borders are, how difficult in some ways kind of circulatory migration has become, that has not always been our reality, And so when I look at my own work, and I think about Panamanians in particular, I mean, we are talking about folks coming and going, and I think one of the reasons I became interested in Panama here, outside of being Panamanian myself, was also understanding just the sheer overlapping and interaction that my ancestors lived through between, my great-grandparents were from Martinique and Jamaica and St. Lucia, and the St. Lucia part was also they came through Costa Rica first because they worked on the United Fruit Plantation. And then, I have ancestors who were working in the Canal Zone, but also living in the Republic of Panama and having to learn Spanish and having to learn English, for those who at least were from Martinique, and had these sort of like French colonial identities, but were in constant close proximity to under and to like U.S. imperial governance, right? And so within that, we're also trying to find their ways as the Panamanian state is really trying to bulk up its kind of nation building as this like Hispanic mestizo place, and so when I consider even just that, I'm like, how do you even narrate that accurately in a way that is singular in attention to nation, and so I guess that's part of the work I see myself and the folks whose work I'm building on, right? I see us involved in that kind of project, and I would love to see more of that as a commitment in Black studies broadly. And I think the second piece of that is what our political commitments are. Like, if we take seriously what you brought up, for instance, as how Black studies emerged as a field, what does that actually ask of us in real terms? Do we take that seriously? I do think right now we're in a fight to preserve a lot of our institutional homes and the resources that we've fought for and gained. But I also don't think that that can be the horizon of a Black studies struggle at all. I think there's a history of risk-taking when I look at what those student activists were involved in that should, I hope, also be meaningful to scholars in the field, right? And so that's something I would also love to see more of. As far as doing well, I think so many things that the kind of non-disciplinary thinking, I think there's been really exciting work in Black feminist theory. That's been some of what's been most energizing for me. Black queer studies. I'm really excited by Keguro Mashadia's work, who is a Kenyan writer and scholar, and has this book called Fraudage that I really love and gives us kind of new frameworks to make sense of kind of the spatial and relational politics of diaspora. A lot of the work that I'm trying to do in using family history has also been shaped by folks. I should have these books next to me for this purpose. But Kendra Field, growing up with the country, and how she draws on her own family history after the Civil War and kind of these early Back to Africa movements that exist within her own lineage. Hazel Carby's Imperial Intimacies, which I have too, and was one of my favorite books. That kind of shifting between biography, memoiristic writing, archival scholarship is really exciting to me, and it's I think a part of that non-disciplinary disciplinary work that we were talking about. So those are some of the things, and I think there have been exciting places of growth in translation too. To my earlier point, I've been reading The Dialectic is in the Sea by Beatriz Nascimento, and it's a collection of essays by this Brazilian feminist scholar who passed in the 90s and who's been so important in Brazil and was very much in conversation with Black studies scholars in the United States as well, but hasn't necessarily been part of our curricula here. And I think translation and folks who are invested in that really opens up pathways there. So those are things I'm excited about.
Thank you. That was super interesting. I always love when books and names get out there, so I extra appreciate that as well. Last question for you. So thinking in a Black studies context, what's the one issue you would want us to all be thinking about, or the question you would want us to all be asking?
I will leave it very brief, actually, just with what does a livable future look like and how do we build it? I think that feels urgent. In this moment of fascism, of climate catastrophe, displacement, genocide, I think part of Black history is surviving and creating with arguably unlivable conditions, and I want that to be instructive, for us in the future and right now.
I love that. That's a wonderful place to wrap up. I was really excited about this conversation, Maya, and this has been even much more than I had really hoped for. This has been fantastic. There's so much for me to think about just in this conversation. Everybody listening is going to take away so much to think about as well. So this is a real gift to the series, and I appreciate that. And not to put any pressure on you, but your dissertation work when it becomes a book. This is really important stuff that you're doing. So hurry up and do it and finish it so that we can all read it. I know you would also like to be at the end of the finish line on that stuff, but it's fantastic work, and I can't wait to see where it goes and where you take us in the field of Black studies. But this conversation alone has just been a really great contribution to this series and to anyone who cares about the field. So I appreciate your thoughtfulness so much.
Thank you so much. It's been really a pleasure to be here and to be in conversation with you. Thanks.
Well, have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.